This worked.
Daniel, welcome to the Leaders Lab.
Thank you very much, Ken.
Of
Lovely to meet
course.
you.
Well, I know we have a lot of complex things, at least from my vantage point. They're complex from yours. Maybe it's your day to day work, but I know we have a lot of things to talk about today. And before we jump into it, would love to hear more about your background, kind of growing up, and how you got into, what is really kind of the. I feel like you're at the epicenter of all the emerging technologies out there.
Yeah, thanks. Yeah, so I'm a first generation Brit. My father is a refugee to the UK. My mother, Jewish refugee. My mother, interestingly enough, is a German. So to have both sides of a conflict in effect, as your parents were, allowed me to see very early on that there were always two sides to things and to question things. My father's family didn't survive. My mother's family clearly did. Um, I was educated in the UK. I sound very British. I went to a very, very good public school. I was a very poor academic. Um, Went to university, studied electronic engineering. Actually, when I graduated, one of my tutors said to me, "We tried to draw the line above you." And the other one said, "For God's sake, don't become an electronic engineer, go into sales or politics." And I sort of ended up in the city building derivative trading tech in the early 90s, 91, 92, which was a really fascinating thing to have ended up with because it was the first time that computerization had really impacted the financial sector. There was the Big Bang, these were all innovative. They were
Mhm.
putting trading slightly faster, they were improving back offices, but they didn't do anything disruptive. And derivatives was the first time technology created an entirely new asset class in the financial industry, which was derivatives. And now some people say it's a multi-quadrillion dollar asset class, the biggest in the world. And instead of being very disruptive to the city, it was actually augmenting the city. And this is really interesting. So you see now, the city is the same size it was, the financial centers are a bit bigger, but the amount of assets that they're able to manage through these things is enormous. Um, I went to the US, ended up working for a very big global bank that was about to be shut down in the US by the banking committee. And being very new there, I elected myself to take the role of managing the saving of the bank. And I was a young kid, mid-20s, trying to save an enormous bank. And it made me realize how difficult corporate change is, even when the things you're trying to do are tiny,
Mhm.
entering a trade 3 hours earlier. But it's very difficult. And even when you face a terminal crisis, so I spent 2 years really understanding corporate change and then came back to the UK and created one of the first companies that managed digital rights for the big software companies. So Microsoft, Adobe, Symantec, we had all their license keys. In a lot of cases, the first time they'd released them to a third party. And we sort of convinced them that the value wasn't actually in the disk that they were protecting, but was in the license key that was being delivered. And that sort of led to the streaming movement, which we missed that pivot, but
It's
we
funny.
became a
It's
very big company.
Oh, not to interrupt, but
Sorry.
it seems almost identical to like a catalog of music that like the Beatles might have or something, right? Like that the money is in the rights, not in the product itself so much, right? I mean, in terms of the ongoing value.
That's Yes, it's right. It's in the value of the product, and the
Yeah.
key was the product.
Yeah.
The disk was just the movement of the
Physical
data
thing.
that,
Yeah.
or the physical thing. And they looked at it the wrong way around. Protecting a disk but letting people guess what the license key was completely topsy turvy. So we turned that around. We then worked with the big music companies, the big studios, and that sort of led to streaming. And I spent about 5 years advising the European commissioners. I spent a few years advising the British government. So I got a very as an honorary role. So I really started understanding what regulation was like. And then in 2012, 2013, I started deciding that I was going to start invest in companies. So I wanted to invest in AI companies in 2013, 14. Really difficult to do. To get a small stake in one of these companies, you had to invest very, very early on an idea.
Mhm.
And the having built companies, the risk of investing in people before they build a team, a product, a customer is enormous. You don't know if they're going to be able to do it. You don't know what that's going to look like at the end. And while I was doing this, someone in 2016 introduced me to something called blockchain, and I was like, "This is really interesting. Explain it to me." And they were at IBM. They gave me a day lecture on blockchain, and having been in derivative tech and being in asset management DRM, it was a really interesting thing to me, and I could see that this was going to be an enabler for the future of technology. So we created this very funky little group called Blockchain Smokers in 2016. Everything had to have a funky name. My daughter liked chain smokers, so it was Blockchain Smokers. And we were going to find startups who could be accelerated and disrupt their industry through blockchain. And while I was doing this, I decided to do it practically. So I still had a few companies that I was CEO of, and I took some people out of one of them and I said, build me blockchain stuff. And that ended up being a very famous tokenized metaverse company of 2017 called the Atari Token, which was founded by me, one of the Ethereum founders, a bunch of gaming legends, and the Atari brand. And that was a future of work metaverse project between 2017. I left the project in 2019. And in 2019 came back to the UK and now do what I do, which is I run a fund which is similar to Blockchain Smokers, but is across the spectrum of AI, quantum, blockchain, AR, VR, and all the technologies which we see as pivotal and in combination, just much greater than any of them on their own.
Is this it's kind of a big question, I guess, or maybe too broad, but having been there in these disruptive technologies for now 30 plus years, and then in particularly in the last 10, looking at AI and knowing that that's where things were going, is it shaping up the way you thought it would? You know what I mean? Like, are we where, if you had a crystal ball back in 2016, is this kind of how you saw it shaping up in terms of what guys like me are using and seeing on a day-to-day basis?
Not at all.
Yeah.
I mean, I sort of got an inkling in 2020 during lockdown. So in 2020, at the beginning of the first lockdown in the UK in April, one of my partners here at Eden Base, mainly to stop me phoning him, I think, and telling him what I was thinking every day, asked me to write the future of the world. And I wrote between sort of April, May, and June where I thought the world was going to go. And it ended up being about a 70-page polemic manuscript. And then, but that got me reading everything. It was a really interesting phase for me. I started reading things I completely disagreed with, papers I would normally avoid, and just reading voraciously every day. And then I would read in the morning and write in the afternoon. And that allowed me to start analyzing things that I wasn't used to. And then we came out of lockdown, and then in December 2020, he again asked me to. He said, "Why didn't you write a book? Why didn't you write a book on the future of technology and where it's going?" And that was when I had a first inkling. I got access to ChatGPT through one of my very senior contacts at Microsoft from my policy work in late 2020. And whilst it was really rudimentary, it was called GPT then, actually, not ChatGPT. Once it was very rudimentary and at one point threatened to kill me when I was asking it to write me something, I had the first inkling of where this was going to go, but I didn't think it was going to be till 2025 that these technologies were really going to have the impact they've had. But the thing I see most about this is actually more to do with Amara's law than anything else, which is, and it's just on steroids. What caught me by surprise was the public excitement and fear about it rather than the technology itself. When you looked at it in 2020, where it is in 2023 is not that different. I mean, it's enormously different, but it's not on a different plane that you could expect on an exponential basis. But the attention it has got caught me massively by surprise. And when I started writing the book, most of it was geared up towards what I thought was going to happen in 2025. And I think we're 2 years too early. I think what we're going to find, a bit like metaverse, however, is next year people will have forgotten about it and they'll be worried about something else. And then in 2025, it will actually have the impacts that I think it's going to have.
What to you is different about the impact that it's going to have in 2025 versus today?
Well, I think the adoption is very hard.
Mm-hmm.
The adoption for corporates. Some industries are refusing to talk about this at all. A lot of big banks are forbid their employees from using it. I understand why.
Hmm.
It's not an unrealistic and unreasonable ask. There are issues with the data. There are issues with what it's going to do to them. There are issues to do confidentiality. There are enormous number of practical reasons why this is happening. But by 2025, I think these technologies will have advanced further. I think they will be much more capable of running themselves without as much human input. I mean, I see all these books coming out, and your future job will be a prompt editor.
Hmm.
I don't see that happening at all. I mean, they're already writing their own prompts. There's nothing
Right.
to say that in 18 months they won't be doing a lot of this themselves. The other thing is, I think we're just about to reach a stage where a small number of people, someone said it, 4 people, but 3 or 4 people that are not tech experts will be able to fire up applications with no coding experience, raise money without being able to write a deck, because without being able to translate it. And these technologies will do it for them, and they will be in a position to take on the corporates with an AI frontier tech solution first. And I think that's going to, therefore, in the next, give it that 18 months of people testing this out, I think we're going to be in quite a different world. So that's why I think the next 2 years we're going to see the adoption. At the moment, a lot of people are using it for cool stuff. I wrote a book and someone suggested a glossary, and in 40 minutes I had a glossary for a book. That's pretty cool.
That's very cool.
But it's not something a human can't do in 2 weeks. It's just 40 minutes as opposed to 2 weeks. People are writing their history essays, and it's passing exams at the moment. So there is that. But a lot of people, where I saw a lot of interest in everyone using it every day, there seems to be people aren't using it as much at the moment, it seems to me. So it needs to get to the next level with people using it.
I feel like there's a level of so I do leadership recruiting, and in our company we do a lot of marketing to leaders, right, to try to get them on the phone and whatnot. And so we're already a heavily automated industry when it comes to reach out. And I feel like my detector, and so is everybody else, is like your BS detector. Like, am I being talked to by a real human, or is it AI or whatever? And so I feel like maybe because people haven't used it in a super sophisticated way, and instead of maybe helping you craft a message or helping you craft a book, maybe people have let it run wild a little bit too much or unchecked, right? And I think that's where some of the flash in the pan, like, oh, this is really cool. It's really awesome when you can talk into Chat GPT and have it tell you, write you an article about the 10 best things to do in Venice this weekend. But then after a while, you're like, okay, I'm being marketed to, and now I feel like there's a public, I wouldn't call it a backlash, but I certainly think there's kind of an awareness now of, I want to know that there's at least a human behind this thing that's talking to me, right? And that this message has some level of personalization to it. Would you agree with that?
Well, it's a very insightful comment, and yes, I would agree. But there are multiple things going on. The first is this technology, as amazing it is relatively basic.
Yeah.
It repeats the same thing. You can tell when someone's written something by it because it's become generic. But that's a temporary state. It's going to get better and better and better and better. The other thing, of course, is the I don't think people use it as much as they used to. There were all these talks that Bing was going to be the search engine of choice over Google because it would give you a single answer, exactly like your very good example. Give me 10 best things to do in Venice, and it would actually write them for you. I thought that was really cool 3 months ago, but I've sort of fallen back to the default, which is if I'm going to Venice, I just Google it.
Right.
And Google isn't using the same tech. It's giving me 27 articles and an article from Time Out and this and that, and I read through them, or the Telegraph, or whatever it's giving to me. So those, as a human at the moment, those as you say, the personalized bits, the fact that I can scan through articles and not be given something doctrinal, and to move back towards where I used to be, which is I'm used to using Google much more than I'm used to using Bing, is the way that that I'm continuing. The point is, we're not working in a stationary environment. This technology is exponential. It is doubling at least annually, if not every few weeks. There is a new technology or AI technology from Google called Genesis, which is somewhere between 5 and 100 times better, depending on who you've read today. I suspect it's probably 5, but 5 is a lot in 6 months. And then there's a new open AI that's coming out that is better. And these technologies will just get better and better. And I think what will happen is they will become seamless. So, at the moment, we actively use them. We don't have them embedded and integrated into everything that we do yet. But I think that's just a matter of time until they are just there.
I was talking to someone earlier this week, and he brought up a really good point. He said the shortcomings of Chat GPT as it stands today is training him to be a better asker of questions, or to ask better questions, which is therefore making him a better leader in a way too, because some of the stuff that he's asking of Chat GPT, when it gets it wrong, it's due to his lack of clarity and preciseness, right, of what he really wants. So instead of write me the article about the 10 best things to do in Venice, maybe we get more specific, right? It's on the weekends and outdoors and for families or whatever it might be, right? So I thought that was an interesting take. And so I'm curious for you though. You mentioned fear being greater than you thought it was going to be around these technologies. I think I agree with that. Where do you think that comes from? And do you think it's in some way warranted, or do you like the path that we're on with all these new technologies as a society?
Well, answering your second part first, which is, do I like them? It doesn't matter whether I like it or not.
Right.
It's inevitable. So,
Yeah.
I've got to live in the world that I live in. People
Right.
ask me about decisions like this person's been elected or Britain leaving the EU. Doesn't matter.
Right.
That's where we are. You know, live in it.
I think I'm with you there. Yeah.
Live on it, live in it. So that's the first thing. This is inevitable, and it's going to get faster. And we haven't even yet talked about the other technologies that are about to hit. The fear is that I think we've always had a media that likes to sell fear. If a newspaper says we're all going to die, people pick it up. If it says it's a nice day outside, then you go outside and play.
Right.
It's
And you don't read the
don't read the
paper.
paper.
Yeah, exactly.
So so I think COVID is clearly an accelerant of this. The fear factor during COVID was very real for people. There were a lot of people that played it up for whatever reason they wanted to, but there was a very real fear. And I think once you've got a population that is in a state of fear, it takes a while to come out. So I think that's part of it. The other part is I think it made people realize for the first time that these technologies can replace them.
Right.
And I don't think people realized that before. There was this assumption that for a computer, let's say a computer, to take their job, it had to be them. It had to be good at catching a ball. It had to be able to go to the bar afterwards. It had to have water cooler moments. I think there was a realization in January, February, March, certainly by people that were writing the articles and the news, that these technologies could actually replace them. And therefore, there was a fear from them that actually, I write an article on, President Z, what he's just done yesterday, that the AI can do 85, 90% of it
Right.
for me. And therefore the fear came out in the way they were projecting that. And I think there's a very real element of that. And to answer the final thing on whether this is good or bad, apart from the inevitability, so it doesn't matter whether it's good or bad, unfortunately, I think we're very early. So these technologies are new. My main reason for writing a book was because my partner asked me to do it for the business, but the book that I eventually came out, thanks in a large part to my co-author for the last version, who managed to help me shape it into something that's a really good piece, is that actually this requires you. You've got to be responsible. These technologies are being built. They are doing two things. They're mimicking, let's call it mimicking. They're mimicking our brain functions and they're mimicking our processes. Whether they do more than that or not, I don't know. And there will be enormous debate and there will be changes. But at the moment, mimicking. The second thing is they're modifying our behavior by the way that they operate. And we've seen that with social media. This is just on a different level. So if you have a responsibility, it seems to me, to get involved in this in whatever way that you can, and to ensure that your views and the way that you operate and your kind, whatever that is represented in this. And I don't think we can sit back and just say someone else is going to do that for me.
Right.
And everybody has some power, be it a user. If you're part of 10 million users, you have power. If you have kids at school, you can go and talk to the school. If you have more influence, you're investing in companies, you can do something like that. If you're advising companies, you've got a lot of opportunity for that. If you're even more senior and you can talk to regulators and governments, then I think you need to do that. But just to allow a bunch of people to build this and then a bunch of people to try and regulate it and assume that they're going to be looking after your interests either by design or by luck, I think is not something we can do. But just to finish, the last 10 years of humanity have been our best ever, in terms of life expectancy, infant mortality, lifespan, wealth, etc. I mean, it's not uniform, but as an average, it's been greater. And I see no reason why these technologies won't continue that trend as long as it's done carefully and thoughtfully. And whilst we're very early, you need to start taking steps now. This is because of the exponential nature of it. Every month you wait or every year you wait, I think it becomes more of a problem.
For a business owner or a leader, what are those steps? Like where should we be participating in not just AI, but all the emerging technologies that you're involved with? Where do you start? Like, I'm a regular guy, consider myself tech savvy, but not necessarily at the forefront of any of this. So where do we start to kind of be part of this?
Well, I think the first one is knowledge. As a business leader, you have a responsibility to your team and you have a responsibility to your customers, and you may have a responsibility to your shareholders, depending on how. And I don't think you can shirk that responsibility in this environment. You can't just hire a management consultant to worry about this for you and a couple of people internally. These are your organizations, and there are cultures and ethoses and responsibilities. So the first step is to learn, is to read about them. And the way we formatted our book is we spend the first section just bringing everybody up to speed on the tech, and we do it at a very high level. We do it we spend maybe 4 to 8 pages on each one. It's not enormous, but you don't need to understand how a quantum computer works. You don't even need to know how ChatGPT works. I mean, I keep reading about it and it gets more and more complicated every time I read about it, but that's not what's important. And funnily enough, some of the creators of it now are saying they don't actually quite know why it's doing what it's doing, but you need to understand the impact on your organization. So that's the first thing. The second thing is to make some careful moves today, which is, where is this applicable in my organization today? My recommendation would be, if you've got a great team of people, then you start using them to augment your team rather than replace your team. For two reasons. One, an augmented team of great people is going to be better than half the team, generally.
Sure, yeah.
The second thing is, you don't know if it's going to work in 5 years, and you might make a terrible error. The second thing is, so that's important. Trying to build up trust within people. If you do this in a sort of responsible, careful way, then you can depending on how your organization operates, it's how are we going to build this across our organization. There are mechanisms you can look at. I know the WIPO uses a system called forums that is very effective for building trust. I think building trust, when I worked in New York for the bank, the way that I got changes made that people didn't want to do was to build trust with people that could help me deliver those. And I happen to be quite good at it, and it worked well. And they weren't always the head of a department. They might have been somebody quite junior that could just actually do things that I needed to do. But building trust is enormously important, especially with these technologies that are either replacing or augmenting. And I believe the augmentation route is much, much better. And then I think you also need to be looking at how your company is going to be changed over the long term with these technologies. That's very difficult because we don't actually know what's around the next corner. And we don't know which of these technologies is suddenly going to have a moment that makes them the one that everyone talks about. The other thing is, of course, if that happens like it did with AI, last year it was all metaverse, 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 metaverse. Now it's all AI. Everyone's forgotten about the metaverse. Still going on. Big companies are still building the industrial metaverse, digital twins, an enormous business, but people have forgotten about them. So you need this steady approach. I think trying to find people that can build proof of concepts with you, that things that are sort of tangential to your organization, but you can see where they're going. To start, if you're a big enough organization, to start investing in companies that might be disruptive to you, not buying them, not taking major shares, holdings, but investing in them so you get the data back, so you can see what's happening and understand if they do start disrupting your business, how responsibly you can deal with that with your business. You don't want a Kodak moment, which is, I never saw this coming.
Right.
I think, Kodak were pre-97 or close to that. People know about disruption now. I think you would be irresponsible with in the face of what's going on, not to be the person responsible for that. And if you're a big enough company, put your head of AI on your board, so he's listening to everything that you're doing, and that you are engaged with that person, because I think it's important enough to do that.
Yeah, I think it's funny when I think fear is obviously a natural, just human emotion that we're going to have with whenever there's change. But these are new tools that, at their best, are going to make us more efficient, faster, better. Like you said, they can augment what we're doing. We can do. I'm not the best writer in the world, so for me to have a little assistance in what I want to put out there, I can still put my personal spin on it. I can still proof it, make sure it's going out, but can save me hours, right, from trying to create that on my own. Now, I saw you talk about one time that even with all this, all these changes and all these things coming to head, kind of in a very, not the exact same time, but pretty close, that you're not calling this like the Industrial Revolution 4.0, right? Like, how would you label, or how do you? I mean, I guess that's a tough question because history is the one that's probably going to label it, but how do you think we'll label this time, this point in time, when we look back on it?
That's great that you mentioned that, Ken, because the problem with labeling something a name is that once the name is there, you sort of act to meet that name. And the problem with the Industrial Revolution 4.0, I think, is the Industrial Revolution to most people is about factories. It's about the steam engine. It's about manual replacement, which was very effective. But it was very effective, firstly, in the factories and what we've got out of it. I mean, we can argue on the climate and environment, it may not have been a brilliant as
Right.
good for that,
Right.
but certainly for humanity, it was it was very, very good, and it allowed us to move from very awful jobs in fields to factory jobs, and then eventually office jobs. And whilst they might be mundane and boring, they're certainly safer and less awful than, as we were discussing, standing in the rain in a muddy field. So it was very useful. But the Industrial Revolution is very cemented in that knowledge, and it's also cemented in the fact that we found a better role quite easily to adapt and adopt. The name I like is cognitive revolution, um, because industrial to me is now manual,
Hmm.
and cognitive is about the brain. And this is about very much replacing brains. If you listen to what people at DeepMind talk about, if you listen to what the OpenAI people talk about, they talk about using these technologies to replicate our brain functions. And they're doing it pretty well. If you look at what DeepMind was doing in when it beat Kasparov in chess in '87, it just knew every single move, and it can process, well, I think, 3 million moves a second, and it just used brute force to beat him. When DeepMind did the same thing more recently, I can't remember when it was, but within the last 15, 20 years, they did it by training a model that then played another one of its models and learned how to play chess.
Mm.
And it was learning how to do it. That allowed them to beat Go. And these companies are building teams to replace how we code. Obviously, coding is something that's very near to their heart. So they would replacing how we do our accounts, replacing how we do our legal processes. And because our world is so process oriented, these technologies are really, really good at doing those jobs for us. So to call it what it is, which is replacing our mind processes, and it's been going on for a long time. I mean, the most basic example I can think of, which I find people always smile at, is the spreadsheet. You know, before the spreadsheet came along, and I wanted to write a model for, let's say, finding a new office, I would write it on a piece of paper, and then if we found a new office, I would rub it all out and I'd write it again, which required me in every step. Now, if I want to find a new office, I build a model, I can give it to anybody in my business, and they can just plug in the numbers and it'll say yes, no. That
Right.
is cognitive replacement. Um, the 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 advantage humans have had is by using a spreadsheet, we've become more and more efficient. Productivity, for some reason, hasn't increased, but we've become more efficient. What happens when the computer does not just the spreadsheet, but can make all the judgment calls that I would have to do and the meetings that I would have to do after that? What is my role become?
Right.
And I don't know what the answer to that is. The glib answer is we'll all become creative. But I have two answers to that. Firstly, not everybody is creative or has
Right.
been trained to be creative at school. And secondly, these technologies seem to be better at creative than we are, or most of us are. They're certainly better than me. So I think labeling this correctly and highlighting the opportunities as well as the threats very early on without becoming Luddites and saying, okay, we're not going to use this, we're never going to use it. That also will end in disaster because somebody will build it somewhere. So I think it's, as I say, you were right. History will label what it was, but I think cognitive revolution is not a bad term.
No, and I think the example you gave on the chess computers was really a good one because in the first one where you said they taught it all the chess moves, right? Basically, it's programmed, right? It knows. It's like here's 3,000 or 3 million commands and how you behave in each one of them. But if someone creates 3 million and number one, it doesn't necessarily know how to respond because it was never programmed that way. Versus the second model you talked about, where it may start a little slower because it doesn't have any moves when it first starts, but it's learning as a human would at a much faster rate how to anticipate things, how to respond to things that has never been programmed for before, and that is really interesting and probably a little scary too. Depending again on where it goes. Um, yeah, that is wild. Why? Where does regulation fit into all of this? Because I assume there's a need for it, maybe incorrectly. The problem is if you could count on the regulation being of sound business mind and good, regulatory compliance on their own end, then great. But you can't count on that. So, but I also feel like on the other side, all of these technologies running wild without any kind of regulation is a little scary too. Where do you stand on regulation within these technologies?
Well, um, regulation is always a blunt instrument, and it's always late.
Yeah.
So, and it's very difficult to unwind. That's the other thing. lawmakers love to make laws and regulations, but they don't unwind them; they just make a new one. So you end up in this minefield. I think I think we actually find ourselves in a really, really hard position at the moment, and which is, what do we actually do? And I wrote the book, and then Wiley gave it its title, which was Unsupervised, which I really like that title. And because we talk about supervision, I think this needs more of a supervisory aspect, and it needs it from all of us responsibly. Again, if we count on regulation, it sort of absolves us of responsibility to do anything, and I don't think we have that luxury at the moment. The other thing with regulation is, where we live in a global world. There are 156 countries or thereabouts in the world, ranging from democratic to non-democratic, with different cultures, with different languages, with different structures. So the first thing is, how do you police it on a global level? So let's say the EU, which it has done a doctrinal, rule-based AI regulatory framework. What I'm hearing at the moment, and I would expect it sounds reasonable because it's what I would do, AI companies are just not setting up in Europe because it's just too onerous. So they set up in the UK or they set up in the US where those regulations don't exist. Let's say the UK and US do equally binding regulations, then people will move to a territory that they don't. And then we become just the user. We don't become the initiator of these technologies. And one of the things that's really interesting, certainly about the AI stuff, and probably about quantum and a lot of these technologies, is once they're out there, you can train them yourselves using another model. So it's really easy to do. The second problem with regulation is that the regulation has to be written and it has to take input from people. And where does that input come from? At the moment, the only people that are being asked to regulate are the tech companies that are building this, because they're the only people that know about it. They're probably not the people to ask, right? Because that will stifle innovation from other people, because as we have in the banking sector or the pharma sector, those regulations also are created as a wall to prevent other people operating in those spaces. So that is also a problem. The final thing is, unlike nuclear weapons, let's say, I can't build a nuclear weapon in my garage very easily. I can't go out and buy uranium and build it. It's pretty obvious that I've done that. But what's stopping me, even if they're very tight regulations, sitting in my garage, training this on ChatGPT, writing something and releasing it? Right. I don't even have to name who I am. I can just release it. The other thing, of course, is these technologies, whilst they can be used for enormous good, we mentioned it earlier, they can also be used for enormous harm. So you were talking about your industry using it already, but you can tell. I'm pretty sure the scammers are going to be using this as number one. They're faster, they have more monetary gains. So they will be using these technologies and training them. And our regulation will prevent us building the systems that can prevent those being used against us. There's a technology by Microsoft, they didn't release it at the beginning of this year, that could mimic your voice with just 3 seconds of audio from you. So someone could phone up your bank speaking exactly the same as you. They can send an email identically to the way that you wrote it. It's not going to be very long before they can have an image of me. How are they going to prevent me having a Zoom conversation with my bank and that bank transferring money around? These are important discussions to be had. And I think regulation, whilst it's these are all well-intentioned. I have to consider that most people building this stuff and regulating it are very well-intentioned. They're just not really up to the job of this. And regulation will lead to unintended consequences of regulation, and we won't know what they are. So your question goes to the fundamental point of this, which is, what do we do next? And what you see in the US now is there are a lot of court cases going on. Does AI learn? That's a great question. I think it does learn. I think it ingests all the Shakespeare's plays and it churns out a play in its style. But if you talk to some copyright people, because it's a computer and it's doing it and not a human, that's actually plagiarism, because it's it didn't actually learn anything. So the court is going to then decide a lot of this. And again, that will be equally problematic to the future of where we end up.
Absolutely. Why do you think, spinning it a little bit, because those are certainly some of the challenges, but do you feel like the opportunities moving forward outweigh the threats, or because obviously there's so much good here. There's a lot to talk about. I mean, as we have been, but we're also talking about, you said in the last decade's been, the probably the most progressive time for human beings in terms of lifespan and all that. And I see us. I know nothing, and if I'm going to fast forward in 10 years, I'm guessing there's still a lot of conversation around what we're allowing and not allowing, and security and things like that, and advances in medical stuff, advances in the way we communicate. So, what are your thoughts of what the positive things are moving forward and what that looks like for us?
Well, I think the opportunities massively outweigh the threats,
Yeah.
if we do it right.
Yeah.
And the other thing is, we're not late. It's not like, I think that an example I was talking about today was, the music industry and the film industry were completely blindsided by, all the Napsters and these sort of technologies, and they tried to rush in late. And their industries are now doing very well, but it took them for 25 years to
Yeah.
catch up.
Yeah.
So we're not late. We're very, very early, and the very positive thing about the media attention from this, even though it was very fear-based, is I don't think there's anybody that can say, I didn't know that that this was around, and that is very positive. So yes, I'm really hopeful. I mean, I do what can I do? And I look at me personally. When I started really getting into this stuff in 2016, 17, I built a big metaverse company. I thought future of work would be a great solution for when these technologies start taking our jobs away. If you look at the Atari token white paper back in 2017, we say these technologies are going to start taking away our jobs. Let's find a future of work which is in the virtual space. And that was what I was doing back then. What I'm doing now is with my partners, we're all entrepreneurs. We could build our own companies, but then we have limited ability to see what the future is. It's better for us to invest in maybe 30 companies a year and have those amplify the message. We're very strong on community. So one of my partners created Tech Nation and Level 39, which are community-based approaches. Some of our advisors build very big communities. I think a community approach is very important. Whilst I have an interesting background and I read a lot, I cannot put myself in somebody else's shoes. I don't know what the issues and the positives and negatives of what those are going to be. If they can feed that in, that will help deliver a positive outcome. And finally, apart from certain factions like scammers and certain people that are using these technologies, most of them are doing this for a positive reason. And if you tell them early enough, these are the unintended consequences that you're going to cause to people like me or my community or this and that, I think most of them will at least listen, because they're not there to cause disruption. I think there is a problem in the Silicon Valley model at the moment. The Silicon Valley model is to break things and fix it. But I think the things they're going to break are things that are too important now. If they start breaking our monetary system, they start breaking our health system, they start breaking our economic systems, they start breaking lots of jobs. God forbid OpenAI is right and it can code better and it can be a better accountant, a better lawyer. How many millions of people in the US is that going to displace?
Right.
Earning massive amounts of money. And then they say, well, they can go and become creative. But who's going to buy the output of their creation, or the coffee, or the items that are being sold in shops, if you've suddenly got 30 million people that had a job but don't have a job?
And that it's happening like
these
that, right? I mean, and it
yeah,
would happen in a flash, not over 2 decades or something, right? It would happen quickly.
it would happen very quickly.
Yeah.
And these are the things that I don't think people are really considering. And I don't think regulation particularly helps, because regulation just pushes, they just says you can't replace a lawyer. But that's not really helpful, because somebody somewhere will create a legal firm outside the jurisdiction, and slowly it will seep that way. They'll use an Indian firm, or they'll use a British firm, or whatever. So but the opportunities are, looking back at the Industrial Revolution. If we look at the Industrial Revolution, Luddites were burning down factories. They had to even send the army out to protect the UK because of it. And it actually turned out very well for most people. I mean, there are certain pockets of people that it didn't turn out well for, and but we should know from our history how to deal with that. The point is, if we act today, and everybody needs to act, from legislators to business leaders to people within teams to HR departments to recruiters to people building these technologies. If we understand and look for the inflections and disruptions these are causing and have mitigating circumstances, one of the things, so we're not a tech for good fund, but because we don't look at technology and say when we're pitched it, this is a good tech or a bad tech. It's how it's delivered. Facebook in 2008 was going to be the savior of the world. By 2020, it was considered a nightmare. And who knows what it'll be in 2030. We just don't know. But we have something called Smart Challenge. Anybody in our community should be able to challenge anybody in our community and have them at least listen for mitigation circumstances. So, for instance, we invest in a company that's going to replace 1 million lawyers. Our CEO of that company and the investors should listen to, well, what's your mitigation circumstance? What is your mitigation if you're actually correct? Have you thought about it? I had a very worrying conversation with a lot of longevity guys in 2021, where I said, if you're right and we all live to 120, what happens to pensions? What happens to marriage? What happens to kids? What happens to education?
Housing.
And they said, well, we don't think about it. And I'm saying, well, that is completely irresponsible, because if you're right, it's going to change a lot of things for humanity, and you need to be considering that before you unleash this.
Very cool. And I think as you're talking through that too, in the regulatory piece, I feel like suppression never works, right? The technology's here, so it's not going to work, right? So over-regulating these things is simply, it might slow down the things that you want stopped. It'll temporarily make it harder for them. And it will stifle the positive creativity, like you're saying, that would have come naturally. But thank you so much. I feel like we could stay on for another couple of hours. I feel like we just scratched the surface here. But thank you for joining us. I'm going to put links, obviously, to get in touch with you, purchase your books. Anything else you want to leave us with, Daniel, before we go?
Well, I just wanted to comment on what you just said, which is a really interesting point. This will move to other places. It's not just the fact, and you mentioned this earlier, it's not just the fact that the technology will move, it's people will move too. So you mentioned, biocomputing, you mentioned what's happening in biology and pharma. Elon Musk announced today that he's looking for human trials for Neuralink. That's inserting computers into our cells. If you look at what Stanford and MIT are doing, they're putting computers on human cells. The Israeli Defense Forces have a cell that can detect if you're poisoned. So we're reaching the stage where computers are going to be integrated into our human body. People go a great risk to themselves to have their teeth done in countries where their safety levels are lower. How far are they going to go to upgrade their children to these technologies? And what can go wrong if we start inserting these technologies into our bodies in unsafe environments? But I was at Stanford recently. You look, the people there are from all backgrounds, et cetera, et cetera. But if the super rich can upgrade their kids so they're 100 times smarter than anybody else, the only people at Stanford are going to be the super rich, because the person that's 1% is never going to be 100 times greater. Right. So people are going to go and do unsafe things to themselves to start being the best they can possibly be. And that is human nature. And once we start interfering with our genetic code, if you add CRISPR in, where you're inserting these into your body and your DNA, so it never leaves, I think and these are all things that you've mentioned through this conversation, the unintended consequences can be large, and which is why it goes back to regulation will just move this to another jurisdiction, and we won't solve the problem. We'll just make it worse.
Yeah, and I think to what you were saying earlier, I mean, I think just embracing the conversation, face your fear if you have some fear, even if it's unjustified, right? And start leaning into AI, start leaning into these technologies so that you're part of the conversation. So I think regulation a lot of times, or our need for it, comes from a lack of understanding. And can we just make it go away? Like, I liked it better when it didn't exist and I didn't have to think about it, right? So can someone just kick this can down the road for me? And it's just not going to happen. It never really has, and it probably never will.
I think Philip Stark, I heard a quote from him that he used at a TED Talk, summed it up really well. He goes, "It's not your responsibility to be a genius, but it is your responsibility to be involved." And
Sure.
actually, that sums up everything now. And everybody, however small your impact, using your technology differently, considering what it's doing to you, talking to your boss about it. If you're in a small company, you said, what should the CEO do? If his team come to him and say, or I go to my boss, or someone goes to their boss and says, I would love to use these technologies. What can I do? I will, we need to be ahead of the curve so that we are part of the evolution of these technologies. That is what you could do.
Yeah, those are the right questions for sure. And thank you so much for sharing your thoughts with us today. I appreciate you. Great to meet you, and look forward to catching up again sometime in the future.
Thank you very much.
Thanks, Daniel.